There are silences, and then there are silences that mean something has gone terribly wrong. The Galactic Concord Assembly Chamber was built to contain noise, debate, outrage, triumph. Entire star systems had been condemned within these walls, their final pleas drowned beneath the layered voices of species far older and far more powerful than my own. It was not a place where quiet existed. And yet, as I took my assigned position among the mid-tier delegations, I felt it creeping in. Not absence of sound, absence of certainty. I extended my sensory fronds, subtle, so as not to draw attention, and tasted the air. Chemical signals, neural fluctuations, micro-vibrations in the structure itself. Every instinct honed by my species over millennia whispered the same conclusion. The chamber was uneasy. Around me towered beings that had conquered oceans of methane, crushed predators beneath armored exoskeletons, and survived stellar radiation storms that would peel lesser organisms apart at the molecular level. The Carthoon delegate flexed its bladed limbs in slow, agitated rhythms. The Threxian cluster pulsed in uneven synchronization. Even the Vol, ancient, near-immortal entities who claimed to remember the first expansion cycles, remained unnaturally still. All of them were waiting for humans. I had studied the briefings, of course. We all had. The term itself carried little weight among the Concord's elite. Dozens of member species hailed from environments considered hostile by lesser standards. Extreme heat, crushing pressure, toxic atmospheres. But Earth was different. The data was inconsistent, contradictory, absurd. A world where gravity itself imposed constant strain on biological structures, where weather systems behaved with violent unpredictability, where apex predators hunted not merely for sustenance, but for dominance, where microscopic organisms could evolve faster than immune systems could adapt. A world that should not have produced intelligence. And yet, it had. Overstated, the Carthoon envoy had declared earlier, its serrated mandibles clicking with a dismissive certainty. If they survived, then the danger is exaggerated. Many had agreed. I had not. Because survival, in such conditions, did not imply weakness. It implies something else entirely. A low-frequency hum rippled through the chamber, pulling me from my thoughts. Security fields were activating, layer upon layer, far exceeding standard diplomatic protocol. Invisible barriers locked into place with precise overlapping geometries. Autonomous sentry constructs repositioned along the perimeter, their weapon arrays subtly aligning towards the central entrance. A murmur spread. This was not normal. Even during high-risk negotiations between hostile empires, the Concord maintained an illusion of openness, of trust. This was preparation. Why? I whispered, though no one had asked the question aloud. My gaze drifted across the chamber again, searching for answers. And finding none.
Only tension, only anticipation sharpened into something almost fragile. Then I noticed something else. The predators were unsettled. Not agitated as before, but cautious. The Carthoon's movements had slowed. The Threxian pulses stabilized into a defensive pattern. Even the Vol, whose composure bordered on arrogance, had shifted their focus toward the main entrance. It was subtle, but unmistakable. They were not preparing to intimidate. They were preparing to react. A warning tremor passed through my neural pathways. Something is wrong, not with the humans, with what comes with them. The realization struck without evidence, without logic, pure instinct, ancestral and unyielding. My kind had survived by recognizing danger before it revealed itself, by sensing the shift in a predator's stance, the pause before the strike. This felt the same. The chamber lights dimmed fractionally, an automated adjustment signaling imminent entry. Conversations faltered, then ceased entirely, as if some unseen force had pressed down upon the collective will of the assembly. Silence, true silence, the kind that presses against the mind. The massive doors at the far end of the chamber began to open. Slowly, deliberately, each movement echoed with mechanical finality, reverberating through the chamber's vast expanse. My sensory fronds recoiled instinctively, overwhelmed by the sudden distortion in environmental equilibrium. Temperature, pressure, electromagnetic variance, everything shifted, ever so slightly, as if reality itself were adjusting. I leaned forward, unable to resist. This was it. Humanity's first formal appearance before the galactic concord. A species born of chaos, stepping into order. The gap widened. Light from the corridor beyond spilled into the chamber, casting long, angular shadows across the polished floor. For a moment I saw nothing, only brightness, only contrast. Then, movement. A silhouette formed at the threshold. Humanoid. Smaller than expected, less imposing than the towering forms that filled the chamber. It stepped forward with measured calm, posture upright, movements controlled but unhurried. The ambassador. A ripple of confusion stirred within me. This was the species we had prepared for? This relatively fragile figure, lacking natural weapons, lacking visible defenses. This was humanity. If not for the tension suffocating the chamber, I might have believed the skeptics. The figure advanced another step. And then, the shadow behind them moved. I did not see it clearly at first. No one did. It was not a dramatic entrance. There was no roar, no display of dominance. Only a subtle shift, a distortion of light, a presence emerging just beyond the ambassador's outline. But my instincts screamed. Every sensory organ I possessed recoiled at once, flooding my consciousness with alarms I could not suppress. My species had no word for the sensation, only a fragmented translation. Predator. Not the kind that hunts for hunger.
The kind that survives everything. The chamber felt smaller, tighter, as if the very architecture had constricted in response. The ambassador continued forward, unaware or unconcerned by the reaction unfolding around them. Calm, composed, ordinary. But the thing behind them, it stepped fully into view. And in that moment, the silence deepened into something absolute. Because whatever followed the human ambassador into that chamber was not meant for diplomacy. And every instinct I possessed whispered the same impossible thought. We had not invited a species.
The Carthun envoy, whose species communicated dominance through direct visual challenge, broke eye contact first. Its bladed limbs stilled, folding inward in a gesture so subtle it might have gone unnoticed by less perceptive beings. The Threxian cluster dimmed its bioluminescent patterns, transitioning into a low-energy state associated with threat avoidance. Even the Vol did not move, but they did not look at the figure either, and that, more than anything, unsettled me. Predators do not yield without reason, yet here, in the heart of the Concord, apex species were doing exactly that, yielding, not to the ambassador, to the shadow behind them. A whisper broke the silence, too quiet to identify its origin, yet somehow carried across the chamber. It was not a challenge, it was confusion. Why would a diplomat require such a presence? Why would a species send this to a negotiation? My thoughts spiraled, seeking logic where instinct found none. Diplomacy was a ritual of restraint, of controlled interaction. Even the most hostile delegations adhered to its structure, because deviation meant escalation, and escalation within these walls meant annihilation. So why bring something that felt like escalation itself? The ambassador reached the central platform and stopped. The shadow stopped with them, half a step behind. Not equal, not separate, positioned, guarding. The distinction was unmistakable. For a moment, neither spoke, neither moved, and in that stillness, I realized something deeply unsettling. The silence was not imposed by fear of violence, it was imposed by the certainty of it. The ambassador inclined their head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement, perhaps even respect. Honored delegates of the Galactic Concord, they began. Their voice was controlled, calm, unforced. It carried clearly through the chamber, translated seamlessly across linguistic frameworks, yet retaining an underlying cadence that felt uniquely human. Measured, grounded, alive, polite, diplomatic, entirely unremarkable, and completely ignored. Because while the words reached our auditory systems, our attention remained fixed elsewhere, on the figure that had not spoken, had not moved, had not even acknowledged our existence, and yet dominated it. I observed them more closely now, forcing my analytical processes to override the instinctive dread. Their stance was relaxed, at least it appeared so, limbs at ease, shoulders neutral. But it was a deception. Every line of their body suggested readiness, not tension. No, tension implied inefficiency. This was something else, optimization, a state of being in which action could occur instantly, without preparation, without hesitation. I had studied combat species before. They coiled, they flexed, they displayed. This one did none of those things, and that was precisely why it was terrifying, because it did not need to. Another whisper, this one closer, one of the lesser delegates near my position.
That is not an escort. No, another replied, voice trembling at frequencies barely contained. The words struck me harder than any physical force. Containment. Not protection of the ambassador, but protection from something else. Or perhaps, protection of everything else. From them. My attention snapped back to the ambassador as their speech continued, outlining formalities, intentions, the standard language of first contact diplomacy. But even as they spoke, even as they presented themselves as cooperative, measured, peaceful, they did not once look back at the figure behind them. They did not need to, because they trusted it. Completely. Unquestioningly. And that trust, more than the presence itself, sent a new wave of unease through my consciousness. What kind of species places absolute trust in something that radiates such controlled violence? What kind of civilization produces both, the speaker and the shadow? The ambassador paused, allowing a moment of silence to settle before continuing. And in that pause, the figure behind them shifted. Not a step, not a gesture, a single subtle adjustment of posture. But it was enough. The entire chamber felt it, like the distant tremor before a planetary fracture. My instincts surged again, louder now, clearer. This being had not yet acted, had not yet spoken, had not yet revealed even a fraction of its capability. And still, it had already changed the balance of power in the room. The ambassador resumed speaking, unaware of the storm building beneath the surface. Or perhaps, fully aware. Because as I watched them, truly watched them for the first time, I noticed something I had missed before. They were not fragile. They were composed. There was a difference, and standing behind them was proof of it. A final realization settled into my thoughts, heavy and irreversible. This was not a contradiction within their species. It was a design, a duality, one to speak, one to act, one to offer peace, one to enforce it. And as the ambassador's voice echoed through the chamber, carrying promises of cooperation and unity, I could not escape the growing certainty that the true message of humanity had not yet been spoken, because it did not need to be. It was standing right behind them, waiting. Before we speak of alliance, the human ambassador's voice cut cleanly through the suffocating silence, calm and unhurried, as though the weight pressing upon the chamber did not exist for them. A simple statement, but something in the tone shifted the air itself. Not pride, not apology, something far more unsettling. Acceptance. I adjusted my sensory field, narrowing my focus entirely on the ambassador now. The shadow behind them remained impossible to ignore, but for the first time I forced myself to listen, to truly listen, because instinct whispered that the words themselves carried danger. A ripple moved through the chamber, subtle, controlled, but undeniable.
Even among the Concord, such classifications were rare. Most species evolved within tolerable margins of stability, controlled climates, predictable ecosystems, survivable conditions. A pause. That stirred something sharper than fear. Offense. The Carthun envoy shifted, its bladed limbs scraping faintly against the polished floor. The Val's attention sharpened, ancient awareness narrowing. To challenge the Concord's classifications was to challenge its authority. And yet, no one interrupted, because the shadow behind the ambassador had not moved. Our world does not merely test survival, the human continued. The chamber dimmed further as environmental projections activated, unbidden, unauthorized. A visual feed unfolded above the central platform, drawn directly from the human data stream. Earth. At first glance, it appeared beautiful. Blue oceans, white cloud formations, expanses of green. Deceptive. The image shifted. Storm systems erupted across the surface, vast spirals of atmospheric violence, tearing across continents with energy outputs rivaling localized stellar flares. Lightning strikes cascaded in relentless barrages. Winds reached speeds that could dismantle structures built by lesser civilizations. The next sequence followed without pause. Land. Dry. Fractured. Burning beneath an unforgiving star. Temperature fluctuations beyond biological tolerance. Then, without transition, frozen wastelands where even the air itself seemed to resist life. Your records note our environmental volatility, the ambassador said. The projections intensified. Creatures emerged. Predators. Not singular apex forms, but countless variations. Some hunted in packs, coordinating with unnerving precision. Others relied on speed, ambush, toxins, brute force. Many killed not for sustenance, but for territory, for instinct, for reasons that defy efficient logic. I recoiled. No ecosystem should sustain such constant conflict. It was wasteful, chaotic, impossible. The projection shifted again. Microscopic. My sensory system struggled to interpret the scale, but the data translated automatically. Organisms too small to perceive, yet capable of devastating entire populations. They evolved in real time, adapting faster than biological defenses could compensate. Weapons. Invisible.
unrelenting. "Our world does not merely test survival," the ambassador said plainly. "No dramatics, no exaggeration, just truth." Silence answered them. Not the tense silence from before, but something deeper, heavier. Understanding. Or perhaps the beginning of it. I became acutely aware of my own physiology, of the safeguards my species had evolved. Redundancies, stability, predictability. We had survived by avoiding extremes. Humans had survived by enduring them. Their gaze swept the chamber, not challengingly, not submissively, simply present. The word lingered. Survivor. It carried a different weight now. Not passive, not fortunate. Earned.
A faint movement drew my attention back to the figure behind them, the bodyguard. For the first time, I noticed the details I had overlooked in my initial fear. Not just the scars, but their distribution, across joints, along muscle lines, patterns that suggested repeated injury and recovery. Their breathing, subtle, controlled, too controlled. Each inhale measured, each exhale precise. Not natural, trained. Even their stillness had changed in my perception. It was not the stillness of inactivity. It was the stillness of readiness sustained over time, endurance made visible. A voice demanded suddenly from across the chamber. The question broke protocol, but no one intervened. The ambassador turned toward the source. "All of us," they replied. No hesitation, no ambiguity. The chamber froze. A pause. The understatement was staggering. My thoughts fractured under the weight of it. An entire species shaped by that world, by that constant, relentless pressure. The bodyguard shifted again, just enough for the chamber to feel it, and this time I did not recoil. I understood. Not fully, but enough. This was not a weapon, not in the conventional sense. Weapons are created. This was forged. The ambassador drew a slow breath, as if preparing to conclude.
"We do not present this information as a threat," they said. Of course not. They didn't need to. For what? For coagulation? For war? For something else entirely? My mind raced, searching for the answer, and then I realized something far more unsettling. Told the truth, and the truth was enough. A final silence settled over the chamber, heavier than any before it. Because now, the question was no longer whether humans were dangerous. That had been answered. The real question, the one that gripped every mind in that chamber, was far worse. If this was what they considered normal, then what in all the void between stars did humans consider extreme? And as that thought took hold, the figure behind the ambassador finally lifted its gaze fully. Not scanning, not assessing, looking at us. And for the first time, I felt certain we had not yet seen what they were capable of.
Activation sequences overlapping, incomplete. Targeting systems recalibrated mid-cycle, struggling to identify threat factors within the chamber's dense population. Protocol demanded escalation, but protocol was not fast enough. Because the Carthun did not wait.
They moved. Violence, in its purest form, is not chaotic. It is precise. The Carthoon strike was engineered for termination, maximum efficiency, minimum time. A forward lunge, bladed limbs angling toward the ambassador's upper torso, aiming for critical disruption points. It would have worked. Against anything else. I did not see the human bodyguard move. No one did. Not fully. There was no dramatic acceleration, no visible burst of speed, no display of overwhelming force. There was simply change. One moment, the Carthoon was mid-strike. The next, they were not. Time fractured. My perception struggled to reconcile what my sensory systems reported. The data did not align with expectation. Motion paths intersected in impossible ways. Force vectors collapsed into outcomes that defied predictive modeling. The human had moved, but not in a way I could track. Only in a way I could understand after it had already happened. The Carthoon's leading limb, neutralized. Not severed. Not destroyed. Stopped. Redirected. The angle of impact altered by such a precise margin that the entire strike collapsed inward on itself. Momentum turned against structure. Balance failed. A second movement, smaller, faster. A point of contact at the Carthoon's central joint. Pressure. Calculated. Measured. Enough. The massive war species stumbled, not from weakness, but from disruption. Their own force betrayed them, their own biology turned into liability. A third motion, almost invisible. The Carthoon fell. Not violently, not dramatically. They simply ceased to stand. The chamber gasped as one. The human stepped back, returned to position. Stillness. It was over. It had taken less than a second. No blood, no dismemberment, no display. Just conclusion. The Carthoon lay on the chamber floor, their limbs twitching in involuntary response cycles, alive, conscious, defeated, completely. Silence followed. Then chaos. Voices erupted across the chamber. Fear, outrage, disbelief. Delegates recoiled, some retreating physically despite the absence of immediate threat. Security constructs surged forward, weapons primed, systems finally catching up to the reality that had already passed. Too late. Far too late. Because the event had already concluded. The human bodyguard did not move, did not acknowledge the weapons now trained on them, did not even look at the fallen Carthoon. They stood exactly where they had been before, as if nothing had happened, as if this was routine. My thoughts spiraled, unable to stabilize.
What I had witnessed was not combat. It was control. Absolute. Perfect. Terrifying. The Carthoon, one of the Concord's most feared war species, had not been overpowered. They had been solved. A problem, with a solution, executed flawlessly. A voice shouted from across the chamber. But even as the commands were issued, hesitation crept in. Because every system, every calculation, every instinct now faced a new variable. The human had not escalated. They had not retaliated. They had not even attacked. They had ended the threat. Nothing more. Nothing less. And that distinction changed everything. The ambassador finally moved. One step forward. Measured. Unhurried. Their gaze swept the chamber. Not apologetic. Not defensive. Assessing. We regret the disruption, they said. A lie. Or perhaps a truth framed differently. Because there was no regret in their tone. Only acknowledgement. A statement of fact. The chamber stilled again, though the tension remained, coiled and volatile. The ambassador gestured subtly toward the fallen Carthoon. They will recover, they added. Medical analysis systems confirmed it instantly. No fatal damage, no permanent structural failure. Temporary incapacitation only. Precision. Intentional. Controlled. The ambassador turned back to the assembly. And then, they said the words. Calmly. Simply. Without emphasis. Restraint. The impact was immediate. Not physical. Conceptual.
The chamber absorbed the statement and broke under its weight. Restraint. That had been restraint. Then what? What would the absence of restraint look like? My sensory systems flared uncontrollably as the implications cascaded through my cognition. Every instinct I possessed recoiled, not from what had happened, but from what had not happened. The human had chosen not to destroy, chosen not to escalate, chosen control. And that choice was the most terrifying part of all. The bodyguard shifted slightly, returning fully to their previous stance. Still, silent, unremarkable, as if they had not just rewritten the chamber's understanding of violence, as if they had done nothing at all. The ambassador resumed their position, their composure unshaken, unchanged, as though this moment had been anticipated, expected, planned. A realization formed within me, cold and absolute. This had not been an accident. It had been a demonstration, not of power, of limitation, of what humanity was willing to do, and nothing more. Because if that impossibly precise, impossibly controlled act was restraint, then the true extent of human capability remained unseen, unmeasured, unknown. And as the chamber struggled to recover, to process, to understand, one question echoed through every mind present, louder than any voice, sharper than any fear. What happens when humans decide not to hold back? And for the first time since their arrival, I was no longer certain the galaxy was prepared for the answer. Fear spreads quickly. Understanding spreads slower.
But when the two collide, something far more dangerous is born. I felt it ripple through the chamber, not as chaos this time, but as recalibration, the kind that follows catastrophe narrowly avoided. Delegates who moments ago had leaned forward in dominance now leaned back in caution. Those who thrived on intimidation fell silent, their instincts rewriting threat hierarchies in real time. The Carthoon still lay on the chamber floor, alive, breathing, defeated, and no one moved to help them. Not out of cruelty, out of hesitation, because the one who had put them there had not moved since. The human bodyguards stood as they always had, half a step behind, posture neutral, presence contained. But something had changed. Not in them, in us. Before, they had been an anomaly, a threat without context, a disruption in the expected order of things. Now, they were a reference point. Every calculation in the room adjusted around them. I forced myself to observe without instinctive recoil, to analyze what I had seen, not as prey, not as potential victim, but as a witness to something unprecedented. The human had not escalated. They had not retaliated. They had not even attacked. They had simply resolved. A problem had presented itself, and it had been solved. Cleanly, efficiently, completely. My species had long believed that intelligence was the ultimate evolutionary advantage, that those who could think, plan, and anticipate would always outlast those who relied on brute force. But this was something else. This was intelligence applied through violence, refined, controlled, restrained, to the point where it no longer resembled violence at all. It resembled inevitability. The ambassador stepped forward again, and this time, we listened. Not because protocol demanded it, because we needed to. A pause. Measured. Deliberate. A lie. No. Worse. The truth. Because intention no longer mattered. Impact did. And the impact had been absolute. We do not come here as conquerors.
The ambassador continued. Their gaze moved across the chamber, meeting eyes that now lowered in response, not out of submission, but uncertainty. The words settled differently now. Before they had sounded like explanation. Now they sounded like warning. Where survival requires adaptation. I felt the shift within myself then. A subtle realignment of perception.
Even the Carthoon, regaining minimal motor function, did not rise again. They stayed where they had fallen, because they understood. We value cooperation, the ambassador said. There it was. Not a threat, not a declaration, a truth. Humans did not avoid conflict because they feared it. They avoided it because they knew it too well. And that knowledge, that experience, made them dangerous in a way no species in this chamber had ever encountered. I looked again at the bodyguard, forcing my perception deeper, past fear, past instinct. What I saw now was not a weapon, not entirely. It was discipline, embodied. Every scar told a story of survival. Every micro-movement spoke of awareness refined beyond natural limits. Every controlled breath whispered of a mind trained to endure what others could not. This was not brute strength. This was mastery. And mastery was far more dangerous because it implied choice. And choice implied restraint. The ambassador continued, their voice threading through the chamber with quiet certainty. We do not deny what we are, they said. A subtle shift in posture, so small it might have gone unnoticed. The bodyguard adjusted their stance, not in response to threat, but in synchronization, as if even their stillness was coordinated with the ambassador's intent. Two halves of the same whole, one speaking, one ensuring the words were heard. My thoughts crystallized then, forming a realization so clear it cut through the lingering tension like light through void. Humans were not the most physically powerful species present. There were beings in this chamber who could crush them, outlast them, outnumber them. But none of that mattered, because power was not what defined dominance here. Control was, and humans possessed it in ways the rest of us did not. Complete, unwavering, terrifying. The ambassador inclined their head slightly once more. We seek stability, they said. Mutual understanding. A noble goal. One many had claimed before. Few had achieved. But now, the words carried weight, because we had seen the alternative, not in theory, in practice, and we understood, deeply, instinctively, that if humans chose to impose their will, there would be very little anyone could do to stop them. But they weren't choosing that. They were choosing thus: dialogue, restraint, peace. The bodyguard's gaze shifted again, sweeping the chamber, not as a predator scanning prey, but as something else entirely. A guardian, evaluating, ensuring. And in that moment, I understood the final, most critical truth. The presence behind the ambassador was not there to threaten us. It was there to demonstrate a boundary, a line, cross it, and the outcome would not be restraint. A quiet stillness settled once more over the chamber, not the suffocating silence from before, nor the chaotic void after violence. This was different, heavier, grounded,
Understanding had taken root. Fear remained, but it had changed. It had evolved.
Into something else. Respect. And as I stood there, surrounded by beings who had once believed themselves the pinnacle of power, I realized something that would alter my species' future forever. Humans were not the strongest. They were not the fastest. They were not the most numerous. But they were something far more dangerous than all of those things combined. They were the most controlled. And in a universe defined by chaos that made them unstoppable. The ambassador paused, allowing the weight of that realization to settle fully. And then, they prepared to make their offer. And for the first time since their arrival, the entire galaxy was ready to listen. The silence that followed was no longer fractured. It was contained, not by force, by understanding. I had never witnessed such a transformation in a diplomatic chamber before. Fear does not usually settle. It mutates, either into aggression or collapse. But here, something else had taken root in its place. Awareness. The human ambassador stood motionless at the central platform, as though the chaos of moments prior had never occurred, as though a war species had not been neutralized within arm's reach, as though the galaxy itself had not been forced to reconsider its assumptions in real time. They were calm, still, present. And behind them, the shadow remained, unchanged, unmoved, but no longer unseen. Every eye in the chamber acknowledged it now. Not directly, not openly, but constantly. Like a gravitational field no one could ignore, even if they refused to look at it. The ambassador spoke again. And this time, there was no tension in the chamber resisting their words, only reception. "We have come before you today," they said, "not to demand recognition, and not to assert superiority." A pause. Cooperation. The word landed differently now. Before it had been procedural, a formality, a hopeful abstraction used by younger civilizations seeking relevance. Now it felt heavier, earned. "We propose an alliance framework," the ambassador continued. "No threats, no demands, no conditions of surrender disguised as diplomacy. Just structure, just intent. And yet, no one in this chamber interpreted it as simple, because nothing about humanity could be interpreted simply anymore. My attention drifted involuntarily toward the assembly as reactions formed. The Threxian cluster no longer pulsed in agitation. It maintained a steady, analytical rhythm. The Vaal remained still, but their focus had intensified, as though ancient memory itself was trying to align with what it was witnessing. Even the Carthun, still grounded in recovery protocols, had shifted subtly, not resistance, reassessment, because now they understood what they were evaluating. Not a species, a paradigm. The ambassador gestured slightly, and holographic constructs unfolded above the chamber floor. Data streams, trade routes, defensive networks.
Knowledge matrices far more complex than anything most civilizations shared at first contact. Humanity was not offering isolation, nor dominance. They were offering integration. "We do not expect immediate agreement," the ambassador added. That was all. No pressure, no escalation. Yet the weight of it pressed harder than any ultimatum ever could. Because now we knew refusal was possible, but consequence was not required to be spoken aloud to be understood. I found myself reflecting, unexpectedly, on my own species. We had evolved in relatively stable environments, predictable ecosystems, controlled cycles of resource scarcity that could be forecast, mitigated, and managed.
We survived by avoiding extremes, by building systems to ensure nothing truly unpredictable ever occurred. Humans had no such luxury. Their world demanded engagement with unpredictability itself. Storms that changed course without warning, predators that evolved faster than memory could record, microbial threats invisible to perception yet devastating in effect, gravity itself pressing down as an ever-present reminder of resistance. They did not avoid danger. They met it, repeatedly, and survived, not as a matter of probability, but of persistence. A subtle movement drew my attention. The Bodyguard. For the first time since the incident, they shifted their gaze, not across the chamber, not toward the ambassador, but directly toward me. It was not sudden, not aggressive, not invasive. It was recognition, as though I were no longer an observer, but a participant in understanding. My instincts flared briefly, but not in alarm, in something far more disorienting, acknowledgement. There was no hostility in that gaze, no challenge, only awareness, as if I had been measured, understood, and quietly filed away as non-threat, for now. The moment passed as quickly as it came. The Bodyguard returned their attention forward, and I was left with something I did not expect: respect. Not born from fear, not forced by dominance, but emerging from comprehension. The ambassador concluded their proposal. "We offer this alliance freely," they said, "without coercion, without expectation of obedience." The chamber remained still for a long time. No one spoke, no one challenged, no one moved to assert superiority, because superiority no longer felt like a stable concept. It had been disrupted, rewritten. Finally, the Carthun delegate, still partially grounded, shifted, slowly, deliberately, not in aggression, but in procedural acknowledgement. A signal was sent, then another. Voting protocols activated across the chamber, cascading through species-specific communication networks. Signals of agreement, caution, conditional acceptance, curiosity layered over fear. The result was not unanimous, but it did not need to be. Preliminary terms passed, not because humanity demanded it, not because they enforced it, but because the alternative had become clearer than ever before.
To reject them now would not be a statement of independence. It would be a statement of misunderstanding. And in the presence of what we had just witnessed, misunderstanding felt dangerous. The ambassador inclined their head once more. "Then we will proceed," they said simply. No triumph, no relief, just continuation, as though this outcome had always been the intended path, as though chaos itself had been accounted for in advance. I remained still as the chamber began to reorganize itself, communications activating, protocols adjusting, alliances tentatively forming in real time. But my attention was no longer on the systems. It was on the humans, on what they represented. Not power, not aggression, not conquest. Something more refined, something shaped by hardship into precision. And as I watched them stand there, ambassador and shadow, diplomacy and discipline, I understood the final truth that would define my species' historical record of this moment. We had not been visited by warriors. We had been visited by survivors. And survivors do not arrive unprepared. They arrive already shaped. There are moments in history that do not announce themselves as turning points. They simply become them. I realized this only after the chamber began to empty, slowly, carefully, as though every delegate understood, without needing to speak it aloud, that what had occurred here would not remain contained within these walls. It would spread, through fleets, through archives, through civilizations that had never once questioned their assumptions about strength, and now would have to. The human ambassador concluded the proceedings without ceremony. No dramatic farewell, no display of superiority, no attempt to reinforce what had already been demonstrated. They simply finished, as if the purpose had been fulfilled, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. The bodyguard remained at their side as always, silent, still, observant, a presence that no longer felt like an anomaly, but like an unavoidable truth. Together they turned and walked. No hesitation, no acknowledgement of the lingering tension behind them, only departure. The chamber did not react immediately. No one stopped them, no one challenged them, not because protocol forbade it, but because instinct prevented it. As I watched them leave through the vast opening doors, I understood something that settled deep within my cognition, slow, irreversible, absolute. We had expected humanity to announce itself as a power. Instead, they had revealed themselves as a principle. The doors closed behind them, and only then did sound return. Not conversation, not debate, but fragments. Broken thoughts spoken aloud by species trying to reconcile what they had witnessed. Controlled, impossible restraint, that level of precision. But these were not arguments anymore. They were attempts of comprehension. I remained in my position long after the others began to disperse.
My sensory systems replayed the events again and again. The movement, the stillness, the absence of excess force, the terrifying clarity of intention behind every action. And through it all, one realization rose above the rest. We had misunderstood strength. Across the Concord, strength had always been measured in expansion, in conquest, in domination of environment and enemy alike. The greater the destruction one could inflict, the greater the respect earned. But humanity had introduced a different metric. Restraint. Not the absence of power, but its deliberate limitation. A choice. A conscious, repeated, disciplined choice to not unleash what they were capable of. The bodyguard had shown us what lay beneath that choice, and what remained unseen. I replayed their final stance in my mind, not the attack, not the incapacitation, but the stillness afterward. Because that was the true message. They could act, they could end, they could dominate. And yet, they did not. That was not weakness. That was control so absolute it resembled something else entirely. Perfection. The ambassador had spoken of cooperation, of alliance, of shared stability. At the time, it had sounded like diplomacy. Now, I understood it as something far more profound. It was containment, not of others, but of themselves. And that realization reframed everything, because it meant humanity's greatest weapon was not their strength, not their endurance, not even their adaptability. It was their choice. The decision, repeated across an entire species, to stand at the edge of overwhelming capability and not cross it. I finally moved as the chamber emptied fully, my sensory fronds brushing against the cooled air of the now vacant space. The echoes of countless species still lingered here, not in sound, but in meaning. History would not record this as first contact in the traditional sense. It would not be remembered as negotiation, or diplomacy, or even warning. It would be remembered as recognition of something we had failed to define until now. Humanity did not arrive to prove themselves superior. They arrived to prove something far more unsettling. That superiority was irrelevant when restraint existed without weakness. As I turned toward the exit, I cast one final glance at the empty platform where they had stood. Ambassador and Shadow, two halves of a whole we were only beginning to understand. And I knew with a certainty that settled deeper than fear ever could, the galaxy would never measure strength the same way again, because humanity had already changed the definition, and we had no choice but to learn it.